Yeah, so we are now going to start the lecture 25 of this course, Indian economy some contemporary perspective, and now we, as I told, that we will be talking about now the Indian banking crisis. In 2016 we had a very adverse movement, so it was somewhat unprecedented in India's banking history, India's financial history, and that we had to take some drastic measures to avoid the shock. And this particular shock was quite unique because we were doing good, our GDP growth was good, we had a strong fundamentals, not that weak, unlike first world countries where in 2007-8 when we were talking about the global financial crisis. At that time we had a very adverse situations, and then it led to the contagion effect on all other countries. Even first world had very difficult time. But then in India we had only the case of interdependence. It was not very contagion because at that time we were safeguarded. But in 2016 we had our own banking system in trouble because of some reasons that we will be discussing. And the one of the characteristics of the Indian banking crisis was that this was unique in many ways. It was not just that it was a crisis, but it was also that it originated due to some regulatory failures, or also because of the Indian characteristics that we have to help and support. So banks and the firms, so banks lend the money to firms, and firms had investment in the risky activities, and at that time people and firms were not paying so much attention. So when the bad time started, these firms had to default on the loans of the banks, and banks were still giving or supporting these firms because these firms were investing in the real economic activities, basically infrastructure, power generation. Then we had the telecommunications, and also in somewhat in the case of energy. So since these firms were investing in the real economic activities, and it was also a designated plan of the government, so these banks were still in support of these firms, and they were undergoing restructuring process and giving certain loans, advances. Still, even in the case of dwindling profit, they were giving support to these firms, that if these firms will survive in future, then they may repay back their whole amount. So there was some kind of underreporting of such type of losses by the banks, and these losses, when it was unearthed, then it became quite unmanageable, and as a result we had to face very adverse situation in 2016. So in February 2016 we had to face very adverse kind of shock, not only on the real economic activities, but in the stock market also, when most of the public sector banks had reported heavy losses, and the loss was so huge that it was not easy to comprehend for the policy makers, and even policy makers had very difficult time to convince the concerned authorities that it is not because of the failure of the bank, certain events were not responsible, and as a result this particular banking crisis came up. So at that time, if you could remember 2016 February and post February, if you have gone through newspapers, then it was a quite a bit very awkward moment, that we were doing good in terms of GDP numbers, but our banking sector was not good, and the certain measures we had to take, we had to implement certain rules and regulations immediately to tackle this problem, and then it took some time, and now we have still not recovered. So this banking crisis that we are going to talk about, it is called twin balance sheet crisis. So we'll have that detail in a few seconds. So if you go through the economic survey 2016-17 volume 1, and it mentions about the twin balance sheet crisis, and that's why in 2017-18 economic survey in volume 2 they had very detailed description of this, that how many firms were tried under the bankruptcy clauses and how they were monitored. So there was a whole lot of debate and discussion on this particular issue. So I have referred only two important documents. One is called Economic Survey 2016-17, Ministry of Finance, Government of India. Then we had Economic Survey 2017-18, Ministry of Finance, Government of India again. So if you as I have told in the beginning itself, that Economic Survey is the most credible source of information to know about certain activities, certain development, certain policy measures that Government of India had undertaken in last 1 year, and it provides a detailed account of that. Sometime you will also find the historical pictures mentioned over there, historical account of some events related to the current development that the government is taking. So Chapter 4 of Economic Survey 2016-17 talked about the unprecedented losses they reported by the Indian banks and how the financial health of these banking system has deteriorated in the last couple of years. The Economic Survey characterized the Indian banking crisis as twin balance sheet. Why it is twin balance sheet? Because these banks, because of the failure of the firms to repay the debt, so there was transfer of shock from the so when the market was not doing good, the firms had to face those adverse situations, and as a result the balance sheet had no better scenarios, and these no better scenarios were transferred to the banks, and banks balance sheet also came in trouble. So for instance, suppose there is a bank and then you have the firm, and bank lends the money to the firm, suppose it is 100 crore, and this firm is supposed to invest this particular amount 100 crore to some other activities, and if this particular firm is not able to invest and not able to generate sufficient income so that it can repay the amount to the bank, then of course the firm is not doing good, so the balance sheet of the firm will not be good, and since it is not being able to repay 100 crore to the bank, then bank balance sheet will also be impaired. So it will not be also good. So the transfer or the spillover of shock from the firm's balance sheet to the bank balance sheet is called twin balance sheet problem. It is called twin balance sheet syndrome also. So economic advisor at that time, he had mentioned about the twin balance sheet problem in India, which later was called as the four balance sheet, which means that it has translated into the NBFC crisis and then also the real estate firm. So that we will be discussing in next two lectures. So the TBS problem explains the risk spillover moving from distressed over leveraged firms balance sheets to the bank balance sheet. Most of the public sector banks reported losses in the second week of February. So as I had already mentioned that the February fiasco, it is called February fiasco because in the second week of February, most of the public sector banks had reported the December quarter 3 results they had reported, and this quarter 3 result had all adverse scenarios for the banks, and as a result the stock market also had gone down by almost like 2000 points or so, and it became so gloomy that it looked like that the banking sector is now going to disappear, and there were a lot of apprehension, uncertainties, and that is why the second week of February it is called the February fiasco. So maybe in your exams you may be asked about the February fiasco. So if you look at the numbers, then Bank of Baroda reported a loss of rupees 3,342 crores, the highest ever quarterly loss posted by any public sector bank in the industry. IDBI Bank recorded a loss of 2,184 crore, while Bank of India posted a rupees 1,505 crore loss for the quarter in December. So these numbers reveal that the magnitude of the shock that the Indian financial system had to absorb. While these banks had reported huge losses, there were some banks which remained in a good financial position. It was Bank of Maharashtra and Vijaya Bank. Bank of Maharashtra and Vijaya Bank, for some regions they had reported the jump in the profit of 55.6% and 40.6% respectively. So this may be because these firms were having different exposures not to these sectors where the banks were incurring higher NPA. So that's why this Bank of Baroda and IDBI Bank became one of the banks which absorbed the maximum shock of the NPA crisis that we had. Now, if you go through chapter 4, then you find that the economic advisor also mentions about what is called the asset quality review. So, for the first time central bank had gone for such a extensive review of the balance accounts of the banks. So, earlier it was earlier it used to happen. So, this one is the regular process, wherein each and every year every bank has to declare or has to at least reveal the number of bad accounts, which means that now accounts which have no earnings, no interest earnings for the bank, and it is done by the inspector of RBI, but or the individuals, those who are involved in such scrutiny, they are from RBI. But for this year, when Dr. Raghuram Rajan was the governor, this exercise was done, and this exercise was quite comprehensive, and it was done in July 2015, and this exercise was quite comprehensive, and this comprehensive exercise gave rise to a huge amount of stressed assets, which means that it led to the coverage of almost all the banks, and all the banks had to force or were forced to acknowledge these NPAs. Earlier it was a regular process, so most of the banks used to hide, because there was a common apprehension among the investors, those who had money invested in these banks, that these banks are not reporting to their actual losses, they are just hiding those debris, and it is important that central bank should look after, and at least the central bank should force the banks to declare the declare the bad assets. So, it was done in the July 2015. It is called asset quality review under AQR. So, after the completion of AQR, suddenly there was a jump of around 4 lakh crore of NPAs from September 2015 to December 2016. And in the September 2014, the magnitude was 3.4 lakhs crore, and it became, by December 2016 it became 7 lakhs crore, which means that this AQR process really helped the central bank to unearth the debris which was not reported by most of the banks, and it included the sample of 42 banks, and 42 banks had this particular exposure. The banks which were badly hit by the AQR process were Axis Bank, Oriental Bank of Commerce, IDBI Bank, ICICI Bank, Allahabad Bank, State Bank of Mysore and Travancore. Most of these state bank subsidiaries were merged to SBI, and now SBI is a consolidated authority, a consolidated bank, and it is one of the largest by size, because all the subsidiaries are being merged now. And then Oriental and Allahabad are also being merged, and I think IDBI also. I will have a separate discussion on the merger of these banks, that why we had to go through. Apart from this, Indian Overseas Bank, UCO Bank, United Bank of India and Bank of Maharashtra had the highest gross NPA ratios. So, despite being that these banks were not reporting losses, the Bank of Maharashtra had the highest NPA ratio, which means that the accounts in which the bank has not received any amount, which means that the interest payment that the bank are supposed to receive on their loans sanctioned to these firms, they were not receiving it, and that is why it is called gross NPA. Net NPAs means when you include the interest or you adjust for the interest payment also. It was also found that banks which were exposed to core sectors such as iron and steel, power and infrastructure had the highest NPAs, and there were reasons for this that I will be discussing in next slide. So, I found this Dugal era 2017 article banking scorecard quite useful, and if some of you are interested, you may go through this. It is quite interesting to read about the asset quality review. So, just for the sake of understanding for not only economics students, but also for the non-economics audience. The non-performing assets that we read in the newspaper or anywhere, it is said that it is a loan or advance for which principal and interest payments are not materialized for at least 90 days and it remains overdue. So, if it is due for 90 days, it means that 3 months if the banks are not receiving interest income from the firms, then it becomes the NPAs, non-performing assets. It has further classification, it is called substandard assets. So, assets which has remained NPAs for a period of less than or equal to 12 months. So, it becomes the substandard. Doubtful assets, if had remained in the substandard category for 12 months. So, these are the criteria, but NPAs is widely reported. Loss assets, a loss asset is one where loss has been identified by the bank or external auditors or the RBI, but the amount has not been written off fully. So, it means that it is not being now part of. So, these are important to mention because in some cases we may not have the idea, but these substandard ones are available on the RBI website. If you want to go through further classification, you can, there is a special mention account also. Under that this 90 days get reduced, so that if you have a SMA 1, SMA 2, then banks start caring about that before it reaches 90 days, we should be taking some actions at the 60 days or before 60 days. So, those are called a special mention account. So, the moment you have a special mention account monitored, then banks start looking after that. It should not turn into NPAs, but once it has turned into NPAs, then after that there are further classification which I just mentioned about substandard, doubtful assets, loss assets and everything. As I have already mentioned that gross NPA is the amount by it is outstanding in the books regardless of any interest recorded or debited. So, this is what it is called, and if you just subtract the interest debited or borrowed account not covered or recognized as an income, then this becomes what is called the net NPA. So, these are just for the sake of your understanding, because these will be coming again. So, I thought it should better that we should be seeing it. In chapter 4, if you go through, you will find that they have put a very nice chart in economic survey volume 1 chapter 4. So, it mentions about gross NPA ratios. It is ratio as percentage of gross advances, that how much you have given and how much it has become NPA, right. So, lending of the banks, which is called advances, and the loans which are not accruing any interest for the bank. So, that part. So, it is now you can see that from February 2007 onwards it was quite stable around 2%, but then after AQR, so AQR effect it can be seen here fiscal year 2015, it has sudden upward movement, which means that the acknowledgement of higher gross NPAs led to this higher trajectory that we have. So, which means that this upward trajectory is showing that the risk is increasing, which means that this ratio is getting higher and higher. Share of debt owed by the stressed companies. So, in this you will find that after 2013, in 2015-16 there is a decline, post 2016 there is a complete upward movement. That also shows that during this period we had a complete upward mobility, which means that we had a insolvency and bankruptcy bankruptcy procedure in place, and this resulted in the acknowledgement of higher NPAs. But here we have a decline in the sense that during this period there was still apprehension that what is the exact amount, how much it has been explored, and those acknowledgements were also not completely fully materialized, though in terms of number we had 3.4 to 7 lakh crore, but it was still going on in terms of acknowledgement that how much is the actual NPA. So, that period might be showing here, but after that it has gone up. There was a report published by Credit Suisse that has mentioned that it is also mentioned in the chapter 4 of the economic survey, that mentions that the interest coverage ratio of for about 40% of the corporate debt this particular firm monitored was owed by company which had the interest coverage was from the firms which had the interest coverage ratio of less than 1%, which means that they most of these firms, they were not, their income was so low, earnings were so low that they were not able to pay the rate of interest of even 1%. So, that also shows, meaning they did not earn enough to pay interest obligation on their loan, which means that their income was so low that they were not able to repay their loans. So far we have covered the severity of the Indian banking crisis. Now we look for the reasons, that what were the reasons for this particular crisis, that what led to the Indian banking crisis. So, the origin of the Indian banking crisis is linked to the mid 2000 investment boom, when the consortium of public sector banks financed the mega infrastructure. So, mid 2000 government of India had gone for a heavy investment in infrastructure, and at that time the investments were made in the power generation, steel, infrastructure, telecoms and all. And at that time, since the macro fundamentals were really good and we had a sufficient scope for investment expansion, I would say largest investment plan in India history that had gone up to more than 2 lakhs crore. So, the investment ratio has reached from 11% to 38% or so, 33% or so. So, it was so huge that most of these banks were having some kind of access to these firms, and there was indication also from the government that you have to finance. So, most of these infrastructure projects were financed by these banks and or the consortium of banks, and some firms, because of whatever we have with the political reasons or whatever, some firms had even gone for over leveraging, which means that the as per the balance sheet requirement they were supposed to get 1000 crore loan, but through rent seeking or other means they had the access to credit, and with that they had borrowed more than 2000 crore, and 1000 crore extra became extra burden on them. So, at that time it was not realized, but later it became extra burden when their earnings started falling. So, weak profitability, over indebtedness discouraged investment by corporate in India. So, that was also a stalled project, inadequate bankruptcy project. The stalled project means at that time many power generation companies were not able to operate, and even infrastructure projects were stalled because at that time the regulations on environment and others were not very conducive, and this led to the investment fall for most of the project, especially in power generation. So, companies, even they had borrowed from the banks, they were paying interest, but because of these regulations they were not able to invest, and as a result they were investing in some other activities and even risky activities, which has not generated enough. Failed PPP models, even public private partnerships, when the government was supposed to go in 1 or 2 projects it had gone, but after that they did not continue. As a result, these firms which were participating in PPP, we were not able to manage the shock. So, many PSBs have financed several infrastructure projects. Stalled infrastructure project has resulted in large volume stress asset in bank. One more reason was that some of the firms had, since the exchange rate was favorable at that time in mid 2000. So, some of the firms had also gone outside and borrowed money. So, they had gone for external commercial borrowing, and at that time since the interest rate was low. So, for instance, suppose you are borrowing at 48 rupees when the US dollar was at 48 rupees. So, you went outside in US, you borrowed the money at 48 rupees exchange rate, but by 2009 or so or by 2010 the exchange rate came down heavily, and suppose the exchange rate was around 55 rupees or 56 rupees at that time, which means that these firms were already having low earnings, and the extra burden was the exchange rate pressure that they had because they had borrowed outside. So, rate of interest that they had to pay, apart from that they had to pay the interest exchange rate differences if it is not completely in the dollar terms. So, those were the cases, and most of the firms started facing. Then mid 2000 it started, then we had after 2 to 3 years again we had a 2007-8 global financial crisis, and after that there were a lot of upheavals, and then government had to come come back again and support these firms. So these firms did not learn anything, and after that 2008-9 it became quite unsustainable, and that's why this, so it had a cumulative impact of these factors on the Indian banking sector crisis. So if you compare with the TBS syndrome Indian characteristics, so it mentioned that the economic advisor mentioned that in case of 2007-8 crisis, when banks were having losses or they had the losses reported in the balance sheet, most of the banks they had cried and they had asked the government for help. But in case of India it didn't happen, and most of the banks this still supported those firms which were incurring losses, thinking that if they go for restructuring of their loans, then it may happen that after some time when they will recover, then they will have they will have the better scenarios and they may repay back the whole amount. So in case of chapter 4, it mentions the NPA ratio. So if you see, India comes out to be quite high, 9.1. Then we have the Korea, then we have Russia, 9.2, but all other countries are quite low. So if you compare the BRICS, then India's NPA ratio was quite high to 9.1, and that shows that how it became quite unbearable. So the TBS syndrome with Indian characteristics was it mentioned that this twin balance sheet syndrome had the Indian characteristics because it had the economy was recording a strong growth, the fundamentals were really strong. So most of the firms which were reporting losses, most of the banks also which were reporting losses, the economy was going on the contrary to these shocks, and it had almost better economic scenarios. And in most of the cases India would have also faced the situation like Lehman Brothers, but because of the regulated banking structure it did not happen, and the possibility of financial crisis was avoided. The mega investment plan supported the growth process and to some extent reduced the supply constraint, because most, as I mentioned, most of the investments were made in the power generation infrastructure, then we had steel, then we had telecommunication, and this led to the expansion of capacities, and this capacity expansion had a positive impact on the overall I would say in terms of growth process of the economy. So for example, we had a Delhi airport, then we had after that we had a Mumbai airport, so the investment in airports, then we had the excess power supply, power generation, that also contributed a lot. So now in most of the most regions of the country we don't have the power outages that used to be reported earlier. It was also that most of the investments were also directed towards telecommunication. So telecommunication sector also saw a huge expansion. As a result, we are now completely self-reliant on the telecommunication front. Similarly, in case of steel also the capacity was expanded, and this has resulted in resulted in excess supply of the steel. And even in 2013 or 2015 when we had an adverse situation, so when Chinese economy had faced the 2015 shock, at that time there was excess supply coming from China. It was a case of proper dumping. In case of India, at that time government had taken measures to make sure that the domestic suppliers of steel are not affected by the dumping, and even in some cases even Japanese firms also were interested in dumping their cheap steel in India, but government took measures, which means that even though this banking crisis can be called as one of the most unprecedented shock that the economy had to absorb, but at the same time these investments that the firms had given, or the extension of credit to the firms which were investing in these activities, it has resulted in solving the supply constraint that the economy was facing earlier. So now we can see that we are now looking to have a Atmanirbhar Bharat, or we are going for Make in India scheme. At that time we were not so much focused on the infrastructure, and thankfully mid 2000 investment boom led to the creation of excess capacity in that direction. Unlike other countries, the Indian banking structure provided support to the distressed firms, as firms adopted the strategy of give time to time. So, even if the firms were reporting losses and were not able to repay, the banks, if they are asking for extra time or extra money, there was a case of evergreening of account by some banks and give time to time, in the sense that they were giving more times to the firms to invest in certain activities which were profitable, or go for restructuring of the loan, so that the rate of interest will be much lower. So, it becomes quite easy to handle. Most of the public sector banks decided to give stressed enterprises more time by postponing loan repayments, restructuring by 2015 no less than 6.4% of their loan standing. So, as I mentioned, there was some kind of postponement of low payment. So, now we will be continuing in the next session that how to what extent we can cover up the Indian twin balance sheet crisis with Indian characteristics. Thank you so much.